Uh,
Oh,
Either works.
okay,
Whatever
okay.
you want. Yeah.
All right. I will share my screen. Can you all see my screen? Yes? Okay, wonderful. And I will set my timer too, so I don't go over time here. Well, first, good morning, and thank you again, Talatha, for just having me. I'm super excited to be here with you all today, and share a little bit of sort of my thoughts and some of my work, but also just a lot of what I've been thinking about lately with respect to this area of racial equity and entrepreneurship, and also sort of the political moment that we're in at right now. So I'm just going to start off. I gave a name to this talk, Entrepreneurship, Race, and the Moral Economy. And I just want you to imagine with me for a moment having a great business idea, one that could support your family, create jobs, maybe even transform your community. Now, imagine trying to build that business without access to capital, without the right networks, and in a system that quietly works against you. For many Black, Indigenous, and people of color entrepreneurs, this isn't hypothetical, right? It's a reality. And today I want to argue that entrepreneurship can be more than just a path to profit. It can be a vehicle for social change, but only if we rethink how it works and who it works for. So we're surrounded by stories that tell us entrepreneurship is a meritocracy. We see shows like Shark Tank, where the best idea wins, right? And there are movies like The Social Network, where success comes from brilliance and drive, or even movies like The Pursuit of Happiness, where we see hard work, it overcomes everything. And these stories are powerful, but they leave something very important out. They don't show who had access to things like capital. They don't show who had networks. They don't show who was already seen as credible. And when those conditions disappear from view, inequality becomes invisible and explainable only through things like effort or talent. That is the meritocracy myth. And once we question it, a familiar alternative explanation often emerges, particularly in tech. We often hear about the pipeline problem. So, my co-author, April Barrage, and us examined this pipeline problem claim in our research, which was published last year. And the pipeline problem narrative goes something like this. If we simply had, more Black people, Indigenous people of color, etc., who had access to STEM education, um, we would see more employees of color and more entrepreneurs of color in the tech field. And so basically, we see folks who are in these arenas sort of hunting the explanation further up the pipeline. If only the pipeline were more robust with people of color, then, in where we sit, we would see, more inclusion. So we wanted to sort of examine this idea in some of our recent research. And we find that, Black professionals and other folks of color, they are present in the pipeline. They are earning STEM degrees. They're working in tech. But when it comes to becoming entrepreneurs, to being owners, to having equity and control, um, that's where we observe disparities. So we show using data from the American Community Survey from 2009 through 2019, that Black workers accounted for 7% of the workforce with STEM degrees, but just 6.5% of the tech workforce and just 4% of tech entrepreneurs in the US. Interestingly, while Asian workers accounted for 14% of STEM degree holders and nearly 15.5% of tech employees, they comprised just 9% of tech entrepreneurs. Meanwhile, white entrepreneurs are not just present, they're overrepresented at the point of ownership, accounting for 68% of STEM degree holders and 67% of tech workers, but over 77% of tech entrepreneurs. So this is much more than just a pipeline problem. Though to be clear, Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous Americans face barriers to STEM education. This is also, however, a conversion problem, a question of who gets to move from participation to ownership. And once we see this in the data, it changes the narrative and the questions we ask. Now we're not just asking who's missing, we're asking what is the system doing to the people who are already here? That shifts the question. We're no longer just asking who is present in the system, we're asking what the system does to those who are inside, because opportunity is not simply out there waiting to be discovered. Scholars like Sarasvati and Scott Shane, they show opportunity is structured by institutions. Whether we can act on an idea depends a lot on things like wealth, capital access, networks, and experience. And these aren't individual traits, they're institutional resources. And if opportunity is structured, then markets are not neutral either. Markets don't simply reward effort or efficiency. They're built on things like rules, norms, and histories that determine who is seen as investable or credible, um, and who receives funding, and which communities attract capital. In the US, these patterns are deeply racialized. So inequality is not just produced by markets, it's embedded in them. And this raises a fundamental question. If markets systematically advantage some groups over others, not because of talent, but because of structure, what kind of system are we operating in? So our central question then becomes, how do entrepreneurs innovate when they're excluded from the very institutions that the very institutional and spatial infrastructure that's necessary for success? To answer that question, my co-authors and I, we turned to institutional theory, looking at scholars like DiMaggio and Powell and W. Richard Scott, who show that industries become structured over time through things like norms, credentialing, and networks that define legitimacy. But those same structures also filter exclusion. And if you don't have the right credentials, networks, or cultural signals, you risk being treated as illegitimate. So entrepreneurs face a dilemma: assimilate or be excluded. And so we wanted to study this further by analyzing 4 years of data from the Racial Equity and Technology Entrepreneurship Conference. This is a conference that I co-founded with Charlton McElwain, who's at NYU. We were generously funded by the Ewing and Marion Kauffman Foundation. And this included over 150 founders, investors, policymakers, and researchers across 90 organizations and more than 70 universities spanning 4 continents using large language models. We analyzed the transcripts and presentations from these gatherings to understand how entrepreneurs describe navigating the systems in real time. We identified 3 patterns. Today, I'm just going to focus on 2. This is work in progress, so please don't cite this. But the 2 that I want to focus on are the responding and adapting and rebuilding and contesting systems. So first, adaptation. We found entrepreneurs of color don't simply exit exclusionary systems. They work within and around them. But their adaptation is not abstract. It is infrastructural. So for example, an agro-tech entrepreneur working across the African continent described serving farmers who cannot afford tractors and often live in areas without internet access. So when deploying services, they encountered completely off-grid regions. and they had to work with local district officials to establish at least 2G connections just to deliver mechanized agricultural services. So rather than accepting that these institutions weren't working for these rural farmers, they engaged in this innovative work to try and restructure the institutions to build infrastructure. So it's not just business innovation, it's institutional improvisation. These entrepreneurs are not entering markets simply, they're also helping to construct and create the conditions for the market itself to exist. And that reveals a key insight. Exclusion does not stop innovation, it sort of reroutes it and places the burden of system building on those who are often least resourced to do it. The time always goes so fast. Okay, the second pattern goes a bit further. So some entrepreneurs are not just adapting to systems, they're actually rebuilding them. And one case describes a community-led transformation of federally granted land into a cultural innovation district. And through coordination between government and nonprofit and philanthropy, including organizations like the Ford Foundation, providing funding, the district implemented tax incentives, cultural preservation policies, and local governance structures. The result was not just cultural revitalization, it was measurable economic impact, with the district outperforming citywide spending benchmarks with a wide margin. So this is not incremental entrepreneurship, it's institutional redesign, and it expands what counts as innovation from technology production to cultural and economic self-determination. And it shows something very critical, and that is when communities shape institutions, we see changes in outcomes. So where does that leave us? I want to close with three implications. First, what our findings show is that entrepreneurship is not only about opportunity recognition or individual agency, it's about institutional positioning and the unequal ability to shape, access, and transform the structures that make entrepreneurship possible in the first place. And second, we see that marginalized entrepreneurs are not just participating in innovation systems, they are actively doing institutional work, often without formal authority, resources, or recognition for that labor. And third, we see that exclusion is not just a distributional problem, it's a design problem, which means it also is a responsibility problem. Today is International Workers' Day, and across the world, people will gather to speak about labor dignity and justice in work. Here in New York City, right at the New School in just a few hours, many of us from universities across the city are going to gather to rally around dignity and justice for higher education faculty. And this conversation cannot be limited to wages or workplace alone, because institutions shape labor long before anyone is hired. They shape who gets to ask research questions and what kinds of questions get resources to be answered. And they shape whether scholars of color get a seat at the table and whether our communities are sites of inquiry. And in our field, this is true, but it's also true in other fields like tech. Institutions shape who gets to found firms, who gets to define industries, and who gets to build the future of work itself. So the question is not simply how we protect labor, it's also how we redesign institutions that determine whose labor becomes visible, valued, and viable in the first place. And lastly, that brings me to this final point. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King reminds us that justice is not only a political demand, it's a moral one. He insisted that we evaluate systems not only by their efficiency, but by their dignity, by what they do to human life. And that's the same standard that applies here. If entrepreneurship is going to be a vehicle for social justice, then we have to be willing to ask moral questions about economic systems. Who do they include? Who do they exclude? And who is asked to do the work of repairing what those systems break? Because ultimately, institutional change can't happen in the abstract. It happens through people, through scholarship, through policy, through organizing, through design, through refusal, and through imagination. And this matters in this current moment because higher ed is increasingly under pressure. Programs focused on equity, inclusion, and access are being challenged. The legitimacy of DEI work itself is being questioned in policy and legal arenas. And alongside this, voting rights and democratic participation continue to be contested through courts and legislation, as we saw yesterday. And in moments like this, it's easy to imagine that scholars should retreat into neutrality, that we observe rather than engage. But institutional theory tells us something different. Institutions are not static, they are continuously made and remade through contestation. So, advocacy for scholars does not have to mean partisan alignment. It can be defending the integrity of knowledge production and advocating for its continued funding, documenting exclusion when it's rendered invisible. I could go on, but I know I'm short on time. So, I just want to leave with this final thought. At a time when both higher ed and democratic institutions are under strain, the question is not whether scholars are political. The question is whether we are conscious of the institutional work we're already doing through what we study, what we ignore, and what we choose to make visible, because visibility itself is a form of power, and so is silence. So thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to the rest of our conversation.
All right. Thank you.